Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to the course Halachic. We're going to be discussing today about the Zmanei Hayom, particularly with regards to the evening Zmanim, to the transition between day and night in Halacha. In the context of studying Halachic, we discuss many halachas, Hilchos Tefillah, many halachas pertaining to Hilchos Kriyas HaTorah, Hilchos Beis HaKnesses, and also tzitzis, tefillin, and many other things. One of the major halachas that are really relevant to all these halachas, but really to almost all the halachas in Torah, is the idea of zmanim, to know when to do these mitzvahs properly and how to do them properly. This is a major sugi in halacha. It is also something that could be very confusing and elusive for many people. So we'll try to illuminate some ideas over here. We don't have the ability to cover the full gamut of the sugya, but we'll try to give a little bit of insight, some opening into these ideas. So with this, I'll just give you the overview of the way this would have been presented in a course of the Man Yilmadu. We give a few courses on this, a few lectures on just on the idea of Zmanim, but I'm going to try to squeeze a few ideas just into this one lecture. And what we would have discussed is the disagreement with regards to Shkia in Ben Hashmoshes, which is basically the machlokes between Ben Tam and the Goinim, and all the various ramifications of that. When Shabbos begins, when Shabbos ends, the time for Mincha and Ma'ariv on weekdays and Shabbos, and the time for the evening Kriya Shema. Those are all very relevant halachos and all very much dependent upon the understanding of when Shkia is, how long Ben Hashmoshes is, and subsequently when Tzitzit Chavim is. This is discussed in a number of Simanim and Shulchan Aruch. In a typical shir, we don't have the ability to cover all the Shulchan Aruch inside, but it's very important that everybody studies the Shulchan Aruch outside. The Man Yilmadu provides beautiful translations of the various references that are necessary. The Shulchan Aruch, whether it's Mishabura, the Alter Rebbe, and everything else with translations. So it will be Reish Samchalf, Reish Tzaddik Gimel, Reish Lamed Gimel, Reish Lamed Hey, and Reish Samach Zayin. These are halachas that are pertaining to Knesset Shabbos, the halachas pertaining to Havdalah, the halachas pertaining to Mincha and Ma'ariv, and so on and so further. Okay, so this is just a general picture. The idea of the sun only illuminates the earth for half a day, which means that the other half will be night, but there's a transition. It's always moving, and therefore there will always be some place that is night, some place that is day. This is a basic understanding of how the world operates, and therefore we have to know when that transition happens halachically. So the three operating ideas over here are the idea of Shkia, Ben Hashmoshes, and Tzitzit Chavim. Shkia is when it ceases to be day in all its respects, which means the idea of sunset, but it doesn't mean that it's night in any of the respects. Maybe in some of them, but not for sure, not completely. Then the idea of Ben Hashmoshes, which is the interim period, and the idea of Tzitzit Chavim, which that's when it's considered to be halachically night. So the question is, when does Ben Hashmoshes begin? Okay, you'd assume it starts immediately after Shkia, not necessarily so, but according to some opinions, most definitely does. And the question is, what is the duration of that Ben Hashmoshes period? How long does that take? To understand this sugya, you have to understand many Gemaras, but particularly two main sugyas. The sugya in Shabbos, B'Melikin, it's Shabbos Daf Lamadan on Beis, Lamed Hamad Aleph. There's many different references in that Gemara that have to be understood in context, but we're just going to explain over here two shtiklach. And then we'll go to the Gemara Safim, which has a whole different approach, and we'll try to get some understanding of what's going on. Okay, so the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Lamadan on Beis says this: Shi Ben Hashmoshes bekama. What is the duration? What is the measure of Ben Hashmoshes? How long does that take? Amar Rabba, Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rabba says the name of Yehuda. Says the name of Shmuel. He says Shloisha Chalki Mil. He says it's 3 portions of a mil, which is 3/4 of a mil. We're going to discuss what that is exactly. Okay, but one thing is clear, is that it's not a very long time. How long a mil is, we don't know yet, but it's not a very long time. A mil is halach mile. And we'll discuss that when we get to the Gemara Pesachim. Okay, then we have another opinion over here. Rav Yosef, Amr Behuda, Amr Shmuel, Shnei Chalkim Mil, Mashech Mil. The Gemara says at the end, I will say Tilsi Mil, which is basically 2/3 of a mil. So there's two opinions, 2/3 of a mil, 3/4 of a mil, but the distinction is very, very small, and that means that from the beginning of Ben Hashemash's time, from the time, sometime after Shkia, when the sun sets, it's not very long until we consider it Seisik Chavim, until we consider it that the stars have come out, and it will be halachically nightfall. But we have to learn the Gemara first in Pesachim to understand what a mil is, how long it takes, and if this is an accurate understanding of how long the process is. Maybe it's actually much longer. And let's take a look at the Gemara Pesachim. Pesachim Daf Dal Amud Aleph. Rabbi Huda says, the thickness of the firmament is 1/10 of the day. Okay, the Gemara Pesachim, it's important to understand this, is that it's not really talking about Tzeitzik Chavim, it's not talking about Ben Hashmash, it's not talking about Shkia. It's talking about a totally different sugya. It's talking about distances. It's talking about how far a person would have to be in order to be absolved from bringing the Korban Pesach Sheni. And in that context, it also talks about this idea. But it gives a major insight into Chazal's understanding of the length of the sunset process. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda says the thickness of the firmament is 1/10 of the day. Teda, what's the proof? What's the average time it takes for an average person to walk throughout the day? Average person could walk 10 parsa. 10 parsa is 40 mil. Every parsa is 4 mil, 4 halachas mile. Okay, then the Gemara starts to break it down. From the morning, which means daybreak, the first moment of morning, when the sun just becomes a little bit above where it was completely submerged, right? It's not yet observable at all. It's not yet morning in any sense that we could recognize. Until Neitz HaChama, until you actually see the Neitz means nitznots, you start to see the rays of the sun above the horizon, which is corresponding, the Pashtus idea of Shkia. It's the morning idea of Shkia. Morning it's called Neitz HaChama, when it comes above the horizon. Shkia would be when it goes below the horizon. So that would be Arbas Milan. That would be 4 mil. So it's a much longer process. Bishkia Sachama Chavim, Arbas Milan. The Gemara goes further, that from the sunset, similarly, until the stars come out. So that process is also 4 mil. So it's the exact same thing, the morning and the evening. But it's not 3/4 of a mil, and it's not 2/3 of a mil. It's a much longer process. It's the time that it takes to walk 4 miles, not 3/4 of a mile or 2/3 of a mile. Okay, that's the Gemara explains over here. There's another opinion in the Gemara later on about 5 mil. The point is this. The point is the Gemara is trying to figure out how long, the Gemara is trying to figure out how many mil a person could walk throughout the day. And basically breaking it down, it's telling us that the Leitza Shachar period to the Neitz HaChama period and the Shkia period to the Tzitzit Chavim period is distinct from the rest of the day. So that leaves us with 2 ways, essentially, of understanding how many mil a person can walk throughout the day. You could calculate the whole picture, the morning from Leitza Shachar until Tzitzit Chavim, and if you do that, and you calculate it, you divide it throughout the whole day, then you will be left with a calculation of 18 minutes walking each mil. But if you just take the Neitz HaChama period until the Shkia period, which is only 30 mil, not 40 mil, then you're left with a calculation of 24 minutes. That's the Rambam. Now, the first opinion is the opinion of Ben Atam. It's the opinion of the Machaber, and Shulchan Aruch, it's the opinion of the Ramah, it's the opinion of the Magen Avraham, it's the opinion of the vast majority of Rishonim and many, many of the Achronim. But nevertheless, the Alter Rebbe and the Gira and many others, like we'll discuss, take a different approach based on the Rambam and based on, actually, according to Alter Rebbe, he calculates actually that Roiv Rishonim, that even though it's commonly understood that the Roiv, the majority, say that it's 18-minute mil, but the Alter Rebbe calculates differently, and he says that really it's the majority that hold that it's 24-minute mil. It's worthwhile to mention, just for trivia, just the knowledge that the Gra and the Alter Rebbe are not exactly the same. The Gra has a calculation of 22.5 mil, not exactly the same thing as the Alter Rebbe, which is 24-minute mil, but the distinction is very, very small. It's almost insignificant. So one thing is clear, is that these two Gemaras seem to be irreconcilable. They seem to be in great conflict, a great contradiction. The Gemara in Shabbos tells us that from Shkia Zachama, from when the sun sets until the end of Bein Hashmashis, until you get to Tzetzik Chavim, so you have a maximum of 3/4 mil, maybe 2/3, but a maximum of 3/4 mil. So if a mil is 18 minutes, like Ben Tam says, so that's 13.5 minutes. It's a very short time. It means from sunset until Tzetzik Chavim, 13.5 minutes in most places in the world. It's not dark yet, and you don't see 3 stars. On the other hand, the Gemara Psachim tells us the duration of time from Shkia until Tzetzik Chavim is 4 mil, which is obviously a much longer period. But if you're going to take that approach and say that it's a full 4 mil from Tzetzik Chavim, from Shkia Zachama until Tzetzik Chavim, you're going to end up with it being much, much later. And how to reconcile these two Gemaras? It's not one or the other. We have to somehow make them both make sense. Okay, so let's take a look at the views of the various Rishonim and how they understand it. So Rebbeinu Tam's approach is like this. He says these two Gemaras are operating independently, but nevertheless not in conflict with one another. What does that mean? That means that it's true that from Shkia to Tzetzik Chavim you're going to have a 4 mil duration, and according to him, 18 minutes times 4 is 72 minutes. And it's also true that the idea of Bein Hashmashis is only 13.5 minutes, it's only 3/4 mil. Now, how do you reconcile these 2 points? Because is Shkia from the time 4 mil, or is it 3/4 mil? So he tells us that there's 2 Shkias. There's Shkia, that's when the sun goes below the horizon, and from that time until Tzetzik Chavim will be a full 4 mil, 72 minutes, but nevertheless you got to break that time into 2. And from 3/4 mil before Tzetzik Chavim, that's when Bein Hashmashis happens, and that's when you have a second Shkia. So according to Rebbeinu Tam, you're essentially having 2 Shkias, and these 2 Gemaras are talking about 2 different Shkias. The Gemara in Psachim, where it says it's a full 4 mil, is talking about when the sun sets below the horizon, and that's the first Shkia. But halachically, it has no real relevance. It has no real bearing. The only reason we calculate it is because you have to know that's a starting point to calculate 3.25 mil, which is 58.5 minutes, according to the cheshbon of 18-minute mil, until you will reach the point of Bein Hashmashis, which is the same point as the second Shkia. And that's the Gemara Shabbos is talking about. And the Gemara Shabbos says, now you have a second Shkia, and 3/4 mil later, which is 13.5 minutes later, that's when you have 3 stars emerge. That's when you have the idea of Tzetzik Chavim. So basically, according to Rebbeinu Tam, to sum it up, from our Shkia, in the printed calendars today, from when the sun goes below the horizon, you have a full 58.5 minutes, almost a full hour, until it's actually Shkia Zachama, until it's halachically, which means until it's actually going to be Bein Hashmashis. So that first time, almost an hour's time, 58.5 minutes, it's halachically still daytime completely. It's only the last 15.5 minutes before Tzitzit Chavim, before 72 minutes later, that it's halachically considered Ben Hashmoshes, and you wouldn't be allowed to malacha, and you have to do everything else before. That's the Ben Hatam. Now, the other opinion, this is the opinion that Alter Rebbe very strongly espouses in his Siddur, even though in Shulchan Aruch the Alter Rebbe does accept the opinion of Ben Hatam, but in the Siddur the Alter Rebbe very emphatically is choizer, he changes his view on this matter, and he very emphatically advocates for going, like the opinion of the Goinim, in regards to all halachic matters, not to be semich on Ben Hatam at all, not the kula chumra really. So so this is their approach. The Goinim. Who are the Goinim? The Goinim were Rav Hai, Rav Shira, the son, the later Goinim of Bavel, the last ones that basically were publishing works before the beginning of the Rishonim, approximately 1,000 years ago. So the way they understand is like this. They understand the Gemara in Shabbos as the operating Gemara. The Gemara says that 3/4 of a mil, that's what it is. 3/4 of a mil. Which means that according to Ben Hatam, it's 13.5 minutes later. The problem with that is that it's really light still outside. You're not going to see 3 stars. But nevertheless, the vast majority of opinions that take the Goinim, including the Alter Rebbe, what they're saying is that a mil is not 13.5 minutes. A mil really is, a mil is not 18 minutes. A mil really is 24 minutes. And therefore, you have an 18-minute 3/4 of a mil. So really, it's 18 minutes. The Alter Rebbe has another calculation that really doesn't start immediately after Shkia, so you have a few minutes, 4 minutes of sorts. So therefore, it becomes a little bit longer. So basically, it does work out that you will have 3 stars at the end of the period of Gimur Vimil, 3/4 of a mil. So basically, according to Alter Rebbe and the other opinions, the Gra and others that hold the Goinim, so immediately after Shkia, or very shortly after Shkia, is the time that begins Ben Hashmoshes. And another 3/4 of a mil later, approximately 18 minutes, maybe give a little bit more for Teisah Shabbos and the other various calculations, are basically like those that are experts in Zvanim like to argue about. So then that will be Tzitzit Chavim. So how do you reconcile that with the idea that's discussed in the Gemara Pesachim, where it says it's 4 complete mil? So there's many different ways of reconciling that. And one of them is to say that's when that's when it's completely night. But that's not a halachic issue. That's just a practical issue. So people will be walking even later after it's halachically Tzitzit Chavim. The Gemara himself, being that is talking about how long people walk throughout the day. So it mentions a 4 mil period, even though halachically it's already nighttime, but for practical reasons, for walkers, so it can still be considered daytime, and they walk even after it's considered be night. Okay. So practical halacha. So like I mentioned before, the Mechaber Ramah, they pass on Ben Hatam. That is also the Alter Rebbe in the Shulchan Aruch pass on Ben Hatam, which means that our Shkia doesn't have any real halachic support implication, besides that it's a frame of reference, that it's from where we begin counting, and therefore, according to the Mechaber, the Ramah, and Magen Avraham, and the Alter Rebbe and the Shulchan Aruch, from our Shkia until the 58.5 minutes later, it wouldn't be considered Ben Hashmoshes yet. But nevertheless, already for many generations, at least the Chumrah, the whole Klal Yisrael has accepted the opinion of the Goinim. It wasn't always like that, but today you won't find it appropriate in any Kehillah, at least not publicly, to do Chas Shalom a malacha after Shkia, which means after the sunset, the way we see the sun go down. But the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur takes it a step further, and he rejects the Ben Hatam Mikol V'Kol completely, and he says we shouldn't really take it into our account with regards to deciding halacha at all, not lakula or chumrah. and that's the way, obviously, in Chabad we would paskin, and in many other kilos as well. Be'er Tam is not so relevant, but many kilos do, except Be'er Tam, just the Chumrah, Taste of Shabbos, that the head of Shabbos, they add, and they include Be'er Tam just for the Chumrah purposes. Okay, now we're going to discuss a little bit about the Zman from Mincha and the Zman from Ma'ariv. So let's take a look at the Mishnah in Pesachim, Daf Menches, Amud Aleph. The earliest time for Mincha. So the Mishnah in Pesachim tells us this: beginning of the Perek, Tamid Nishcha b'Shmeina Mechza. The carbon tamid, the daily sacrifice that was done in the morning and the evening, in the afternoon, so it was always brought on a regular day, b'Shmeina Mechza, 8.5 hours of the day. Day is 12 hours. Talking about the day from the equinox, which is 12 hours by day, 12 hours by night. So it was brought at 8.5 hours in the day. That was when it was not brought, sorry. That was when it was nishchat. When it was slaughtered. But it was actually brought, sacrificed, burned on the altar, burned on the Mizbeach, 9.5 hours. There's a process. There's a whole process, brought within the Mishnayos, Seches Tamid, Gemara. Exactly the process, the procedure for doing the carbon tamid. That was on a regular day. Ba'arbi Pesachim and Erev Pesach, they needed time. Why? Because, generally speaking, the last carbon was the carbon tamid. Aleh hashtin kol kaparas klum. That was the completion for the day. That was the lid. But the carbon Pesach had to be done dafke, specifically after carbon tamid. So that was different. So they needed enough time to be able to bring the carbon Pesach from the carbon tamid time until the end, until the evening. So regular Pesach, a regular quiz. So they would do it b'sheva machza. They would do it an hour earlier, 7.5 hours into the day, and then they would bring the carbon on the Mizbeach 8.5 hours. Bein b'chel bein b'Shabbos. And that is whether it was weekday or Shabbos, it didn't make a difference. It was only a unique circumstance when it was Chol Erev Pesach Liyas be'erev Shabbos. When Erev Pesach ended up being on Erev Shabbos, so then you have a problem. What's the problem? The problem is that if Erev Pesach is Shabbos or weekday, you could just hold off, and after you brought your carbon Pesach, which is a mitzvah, you do it on Shabbos, not a problem. But with regards to roasting it and preparing it for the Seder, you would do it in the evening, but the Shabbos. But if tonight is Shabbos, which means it's Erev Shabbos on Erev Pesach, so then you have to do all the preparations before Shabbos, because there's no heter to roast it on Shabbos, because it's not necessary to roast it on Shabbos. The mitzvah is to roast it before the Seder. It doesn't have to be before Shabbos. It doesn't have to be on Shabbos, it can be before Shabbos. So an instance of Chol Erev Pesach Liyas be'erev Shabbos, when Erev Pesach worked out to be on Erev Shabbos, so then Friday, Nishcha b'Sheish Mechza, so then you brought the carbon by the earliest possible time. What's the earliest possible time? 6.5 hours. So if you have a day that's from 6 to 6, that's a typical day by the equinox, right? It's 12-hour days. So that would be 6.5 hours, a half an hour after Chatzos. Why a half an hour after Chatzos? Because we had to ascertain that it was actually Chatzos. Kinotul Salierev that we learned. That basically when you saw the shade start to turn, in Beis Hamikdash, they would see the shade in the walls. So they would do it from the earliest possible opportunity, which is 6.5 hours, a half an hour after Chatzos, after midday. And then they would bring the carbon 7.5 hours in a day, hour later, because it took time to make the carbon prepared. But Pesach Acharav, and in this instance, they would bring the carbon Pesach the whole afternoon with having enough time to be tzayla, to roast and prepare the carbon Pesach for the evening. Okay, so over here we have a diagram on the bottom of this page where you'll see the general outline of the afternoon. Chatzos is midday, exactly. But if you don't have a clock, it's very hard to be able to ascertain with certainty that it's midday. So that's the idea, that they waited a half an hour. Kinot Salierev, they would see the shadows, and that's what we call Mincha Gedela. Why do we call Mincha Gedela? Because we know that the tefillah is connected to Midim Tiknum, that they establish prayers corresponding to the Karbanas, particularly the regular Tmidim, the regular Karbanas Tmidim Kesidra, and therefore being that the carbon tamid was brought throughout the afternoon. We see there's 3 instances: 6.5, 7.5, 8.5. So therefore, the whole afternoon technically is the Zman for Mincha. But nevertheless, there's really a division, or maybe a preferred time and not preferred time. What's the division? Is Chatzos is when technically they could have brought the carbon tamid, but being they never brought it that time because they weren't able to ascertain with certainty that it was actually Chatzos, so therefore they brought it half an hour later, which is Mincha Gedola. And it's called Mincha Gedola because it's a bigger portion than the Mincha Tana, the second portion, because that's the time that it was typically brought. We mentioned that typically it was brought b'tishel mechza, 9.5 hours into the day, right? They sechted it 8.5 hours, and they actually were makir it. They actually elevated on the altar on the Mizbech by 9.5 hours. So that's what we call minchitana, being that it's 2.5 hours left to the day, so it's a smaller portion. So we'll see that there are opinions that you should actually preferably daven minchitana, because minchitana is really the time that they would typically bring the carbon tamid min arbaim. But nevertheless, we'll discuss that further on. And then you have the end of the day, which is 6 o'clock, let's say, is the time of Shkia, and that, but pashtus, would be the end of the time for Mincha. Not necessarily so. There is an argument that could be made, it's Bar Halacha, that you could daven Mincha until it's time for Ma'ariv. The Alter Rebbe in a Siddur, even though he's very emphatically pro the Goinim and rejects Rabbeinu Tam's opinion also as emphatically, but nevertheless he does give a bit of leeway with regards to Mincha after Shkia, and he says as long as it's Hashmashis, it's not clearly night, there is an understanding that possibly Mincha can still be davened, Darabana, various other calculations Alter Rebbe has over there. Okay, let's take a look at the Gemara over here. Sofim, Daftam Ches, Amid Aleph, right? The same Gemara, just the Hemshech of the Gemara. Elo Amarava Mitzvah Yatam Mishinot Utzal Yerev, right? So what's the idea? The mitzvah of the carbon tamid is when Mishinot, when you start to see the bending of the evening shadows. My taima, what's the reason for this? Tamar Kra, the Pakitel, Ben Arbaim, between the Arbaim, Erev, the Arbaim, the evening, so to speak, in the Matlashim Shalom Erev, when you start to see the sun going towards the evening, towards the setting. So throughout the year, you have various personal offerings, gifts, vows, and many other whatever offerings that people are just bringing by themselves. And the Torah says that this is supposed to be the last. Is the tamid min arbaim is supposed to be the last carbon, so you have to include everything else before. Yeah, and v'amar aleh Hashem kol kavanas kulam. All right, the pasuk says aleh chav shlom, and the Chazal learn that means should be the last one. So you push off the carbon tamid for 2 hours. And you start to shecht it by 8.5 hours. By Risafin, you get better Acharov, and Erev Pesach, being that you need more time. So you bring it earlier an hour, you bring it 7.5 hours. When Erev Pesach comes on Erev Shabbos, you need also to roast it. B'dachei Shabbos, and roasting it, being that it's not really important to do it on Shabbos, you can do it before. So then you would do it by the initial time, the time that's the earliest possible time, which is 6.5 hours. So the Gemara is just explaining what we just explained before outside. Okay. So if you look at Shulchan Aruch, based on the Rambam, the Mechaber, it's worthwhile to mention that there isn't any Alter Rebbe that we have on Hilchos Tfilas HaMincha or Tfilas Arvis, which is a major loss to us. So we can't really say with certainty all the Alter Rebbe's opinions on this matter, but we use the Shulchan Aruch, Mishnah Berurah, and there are other references throughout the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch that we gain some insight into Alter Rebbe's thinking on this matter. So what we have over here is the Shulchan Aruch where it says Misha Spal Tfilas HaMincha L'Charbav Shois Mertzel L'Mali Yotza, that a person davens from what we call Mincha Gedela, So he's yotza, which means it's okay. It's not the proper time to daven. So from chatzos until mincha gedela, the first half an hour, it seems you're not even yotza. At least what it seems from the simple shalash. And from 6.5 hours until 9.5 hours, until we call Mechatana, Yotza. But they have it. The Ikir Zmana, but nevertheless, the main time down mincha, according to the Mechaber Shulchan Aruch, the time that we typically bring the carbon, which is 9.5 hours and onwards. This is something that you don't see people being makpid on much. The Rebbe himself, davened, typically mincha gedela, which was 3:15, is almost always mincha gedela, even in the winter. I think so. Yes. The winter maybe not, but for sure in the summer it's special day. Okay, so the Mishnah Berurah does bring an opinion that you could daven even chachila, and it brings a shaynim that say so, and that's actually what's widely accepted in halacha. You don't see people that are makpid dafke daven mechatana. There are people that are makpid daven mechatana, but not only for that reason, they have other interests as well. Al pi Kabbalah, al pi halacha, this idea of mitzvah spal to do mechama, to daven, early in the morning and late in the evening to connect the day and the night. Both halachically and kabbalistically, it's brought Narizal that he was makpid daven micha late, right before Shkia, to daven to connect the micha and the ma'ariv. But the idea that people would not daven micha leila is not really so prevalent nowadays. But regardless, everybody agrees that if you have a specific reason, right? Mitigating factor, that it's better to daven mincha earlier than do something before that maybe you would miss it, and so on and so forth. So the question is, what do we do about the first half an hour? I mean, biblically speaking, the first half an hour is the afternoon. Technically, you could bring the carbon then. LMI, you wouldn't bring the carbon ever because there wasn't, you didn't see the shadows yet. They didn't have the ability to ascertain it. But nowadays you have a clock, so you do know with certainty that it's already chatzos. So why can't we daven mincha before a half an hour, before half an hour after chatzos? And the answer is we can't daven mincha because that wasn't the time that it was done the Beis Mikdash, and therefore being that tefillos connected to minum tiknon, the tefillos were established corresponding to the tefillos, so you can't just make your own thing. The question is, what happens if you did? B'di'evet. So according to Mishnah Berurah and other Achreinim, they hold you weren't Yetzah, but there are other Achreinim that say that being there's a suffix, so you wouldn't daven again, because technically it was after Chatzos. There's a discussion in the Achreinim about saying Karbanis before the beginning of Mechadela. There's not a clear resolution on that issue. But with regards to davening, no one's matal chachila daven. It's only an issue of after the fact, b'di'evet. Okay, so now we're going to get to discuss the idea of ma'ariv. When does the time for ma'ariv start? So we have the Mishnah, the Gemara and Brachos, famous Gemara, Tfilas HaShachar, where it tells us Tfilas HaMincha, the Erev Mincha goes to the evening. That's really the source that the person would say that you could daven even after Shkia, because it doesn't say till Shkia, it says Erev. So if it's not completely Laila, maybe there's an argument that it could be till Laila Gomer. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Eimer Ad Plaga Mincha. But nevertheless, Rabbi Yehuda says that you could only daven Mincha till Plaga Mincha. What's Plaga Mincha? Plaga Mincha is like this. Plaga Mincha is that if you take the second portion, we said 9.5 hours is Minchatana, is the second portion. So if you take that time until the night, you divide it in half. So you take 2.5 and divide it in half, so you have 1.25 and 1.25. That's Plaga Mincha, half of the second Mincha. So being that they always finished the carbon tamin shebin arbaim by that time, by an hour, a quarter before evening, and then they started to actually do the preparations for the evening and burning the extra fats and the vodim, the extra meals, whatever it was, from that time there's a mikdash. So therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he says that's the proper time you daven ma'ariv as well. And the Gemara starts to discuss this. Amar of Chis, the next year, let's see. Let's analyze this. Mi derav tzoli matli shoshas be'erev Shabbos b'yidyoim shema min olav Rabbi Yehuda. So Rav Chisda is trying to resolve this issue that you have Maflekes in Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbanan. What's the proper time for Ma'ariv? Rabbi Yehuda says that you could daven mincha to plug a mincha, and from then on you could daven Ma'ariv. And the Rabbanan say otherwise, that Ma'ariv can only be done, that mincha is Ada Erev, and Ma'ariv can only be done from the Erev, from the evening. So he brings a proof from the fact that Rav would be Makabel Shabbos early, and he would daven the Shabbos to get tefillah on Erev Shabbos, which means it was still light outside. It was from Plaga Mincha. So that is a Ma'aser Rav, right? That is an example where you see Rabbi Yehuda's halacha was practiced, which means that would be the halacha. Usually, if you bring a Ma'aser Rav, you bring an example where a great sage used a specific psak. That means that it was accepted psak. Shema Melech Rabbi Yehuda. So that would be a proof according to Rav Chisda that we pass like Rabbi Yehuda, which means you could daven mincha only until Plaga Mincha, the hour and a quarter before nightfall, before sunset, and from that time you can daven Ma'ariv. So the Gemara says no, Adarabba, Pum Fakert. It's good information to know that Rav daven Ma'ariv early on Erev Shabbos, but Rav Huna and Rabbanan did not daven Ma'ariv early on Erev Shabbos, and they were particular to wait till the evening. Shema Mina Yinach Rabbi Yehuda, they're arrived, right? The Rav Huna and Rabbanan, yeah. So they didn't accept Shabbos early, or maybe they did accept Shabbos early, but they didn't have Ma'ariv early. So that would be a proof that we don't pass near Buddha and we pass near Rabbanan, which means you can't daven Ma'ariv early, you can't daven, and you could daven Mincha even later. So, being that we have two Ma'aser Ravs, we have two examples of halacha being implemented in two different manners. So the Gemara says, being now that we don't have the halacha decided, not according to this opinion or according to that opinion, so therefore, the Gemara brings an very interesting psak. The Avid Kamar Avid, a person does like this is Avid, he did right, and a person does like that, he did right. Which means whatever you do, you're doing right. You're going according to Rabbi Yehuda, you're right, you're going to Rabbanan, you're right, which means that you could daven Ma'ariv early, if that's your fancy, if you want to pass like Rabbi Yehuda, or you could daven Mincha late, if that's your fancy, you want to pass like Rabbanan. Okay. But it's worthwhile to know, and we'll learn this a little bit further on, but you can't mix these two things, except you can't have this conflict where you're going to daven Mincha late and Ma'ariv early. But we'll discuss that, maybe even that sometimes could be lenient. We could be lenient in that issue. Okay. So the Shulchan Aruch, Machaber, says Ikir Zmana, the main time is Adalai Rabbanan, right? Which means that you could have a mincha all the way till nightfall. Rabbi Yehuda Plaga Mincha, but nevertheless Rabbi Yehuda has the opinion that it's still Plaga Mincha, which is until 10 3/4 hours, which means an hour and a quarter before evening. Shu Seif Achazet Shois Chasavia, which is the end of 11 hours missing a quarter, which is 10 3/4 hours. Vasikna, but the Gemara path, as we mentioned this, the other Gemara of it, that whichever opinion you take is okay. Which he asked him, but the Mechaber here and Shalach Paskins clearly, but you must take consistent approach. You can't decide to do both at the same time. And what the same time means is discussed a lot in the Achronim, and maybe we'll get a chance to discuss that over here as well. Okay, so one approach is like this. This is the Mishnah Berurah. Is he says that if it's b'diavad, we're in a difficult circumstance, so you could mix both opinions. Even though the Shulchan Aruch says that lo'olam, that you should always consistently follow one opinion, either Rabbanan or Rabbi Yehuda. So either you daven Mincha late or you daven Ma'ariv early, but not both. But Mishnah Berurah nevertheless says that b'diavad, Shasad Chak, you could say one day I'm following Rabbi Yehuda and you're going to daven Ma'ariv early, and one day you're late and you daven Mincha late. As long as it's a different day, it's okay. But he learned pshat that it's a conflict only really if it's in the same day. To daven Michleit, that's the real conflict. But nevertheless, the Mishnah Berurah brings down, the Halachic and other Achronim, they bring that the truth is that even if it's in the same day, and you'll see this in many shuls, people ask, how can it be? It's mamash against halacha. But nevertheless, they say that when it's kosher, let's say if minyan, it's hard to get a minyan. People come to mincha ma'ariv. So if you make mincha too early before plaga mincha, before hour and a quarter before evening, and you're not going to get a minyan that way. So they just make a mincha ma'ariv. And mincha ma'ariv could be even if both of them are after plug. It's not a chachila. It doesn't have any real basis in halacha really, because it's against clearly what we say, that it can't be this conflict, can't accept the Rehuda and Rabbanan together. But nevertheless, because it's kosher less of minyan, because it's hard to get a minyan, so that is something that is widely practiced in many shuls, even though it's also very much frowned upon in halacha. But it's accepted in halacha. One karvan is Erev Shabbos. Erev Shabbos you have an additional aspect. What's Erev Shabbos? What's unique about Erev Shabbos? Erev Shabbos you have a mitzvah of Teis Shabbos. It's not just a preference. You want to go home early. It's worthwhile to mention that in the days of the Rishonim and Ashkenaz, they always daven Ma'ariv early. It was dangerous to go out at night, and you'll see almost all the references to Ma'ariv was always Boydiyim, was always by day. Alter Rebbe's famous tshuva, where he says that only in recent generations, it seems was very recent. In the Alter Rebbe's days, a little before that, people started to makpid until Arvis with Mana to daven Ma'ariv by night. But it seems that throughout Ashkenaz, throughout the days of the Shem, they always daven Ma'ariv early. But on Erev Shabbos, it wasn't just about convenience and about safety and security. On Erev Shabbos, we have a specific mandate to make Teis Shabbos. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to mekabel Shabbos and daven Ma'ariv early. And if you hold the Yishun daven Ma'ariv early, like the Rabbanan, and possibly according to Rehuda, because it's worthwhile to mention that even if you pass like Rehuda, like the Shulchan Aruch says, like Gemara says, you could pass like Rehuda, you have the right to do that, but it doesn't necessarily include Birchas Krishma and everything else. The Pashtus only includes Shemini Esrei, and being that we want to daven the whole Ma'ariv properly, so it's a major b'diavad to daven the whole Ma'ariv properly before this man. And that's what Alter was writing that tshuva, that he says nowadays people are more makpid to daven Ma'ariv bismana because it's not so poshut to daven Krishma early as well. But Erev Shabbos, being that you want to add from Chil to Kodesh, so even if you always daven Ma'ariv bismana, so that's an additional reason to be makel for yourself and daven Ma'ariv early. But nevertheless, you have to make sure to daven mincha earlier, because you don't want to have this Tartis Asri in the same day. But again, he brings over here in the slide that for a tzibur, there are dachrinim that are makel in that matter.